aficionado extraordinary, the incomparable Lanny Crawford. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. Wow, that's a pretty high bar to jump over, but I will do my best. So I'm just really thrilled to be here and to see such a big crowd here today. I assume you're here because you like to grow plants and you accept the idea that plants can be medicinal, or you're at least medicinal plant curious. So the 60,000 words in my book are intended to make the case that plants can be medicinal and they should be returned to their rightful place in the U.S. pharmacopoeia, which physicians have to use to determine what they can prescribe as a drug. I'm not going to make a deep dive into the pharmacology of the plants. I'll leave that up to the book, and within the book you can choose to skip over those sections if it's too many 8-syllable words for you to digest at one time. But I am going to touch on that because I can't really talk about these plants being medicinal without explaining a little bit about how it is that they are. So, but I'm also here to talk about how you can grow these plants, where they're suitable, to the best of my ability. And fortunately, we're surrounded by plant growing experts here at Green Thumb. And I do want to acknowledge Richard, who has gone to great lengths to increase the native plant supply here at Green Thumb. It's one of the best stocks of native plants that you're going to find in a nursery in Southern California right now, other than, say, the Theodore Payne Foundation in Sun Valley, which is dedicated exclusively to native plants. So I've organized my talk in the same way that the book is organized. I'm going by families because I think it's important to know what families plants are in. And the families are organized alphabetically by their scientific name. And then within the families, the individual plants are also organized by their scientific name, genus and species. So I'm going to go through the list in that way. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. I think, Richard, when you're done there, you said you were going to hold the plants up and pass them around? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to start with the lizard tail family. And I can't tell you why. This plant doesn't look like a lizard to me, but it does have runners, so maybe it has something to do with that. In any case, the lizard tail family is part of one of the earliest evolving groups of plants that have a common ancestor in the magnolia tree. And these plants in this family, can you hold up the Anomopsis californica? The plants in this family are typically aromatic, and these aromatic compounds are what give them their medicinal properties. So let me get organized here. There we go. So yerba mansa is a perennial herb. That means once it's established, it just keeps growing in the same place and comes back year after year. It grows in colonies, so it spreads by rhizomes, and you can actually see some of those red rhizomes already reaching out of that pot and wanting to start traveling across the soil. It's a water plant. It likes to be in damp soil. It likes to grow in ponds and marshes, places like that. So if you have a pond, if you have someplace wet, if you have a water supply that you don't have to pay an arm and a leg for, then this is a great plant to consider. It's definitely not a drought-tolerant plant. Most of these natives are, but yerba mansa is something that's more associated with marshes. Now, in nature, yerba mansa is not on the endangered lists yet, but it is on the at-risk list of a group called United Plant Savers, and you can check them out online. They are advocates for making sure that we have a continuous supply of native medicinal plants in nature. And they have put yerba mansa and white sage, which we're going to get to later, on that list of species at risk because of over-harvesting due to their medicinal properties. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. I want to encourage people to use plants as medicine, but at the same time, there's a limited supply of some of these plants. So we have to be ecological, we have to think about sustainability, and my book gets into all that, and that's why I'm going to mention the conservation status of these plants as we go. And the more that they're limited in nature, the more reason for you to plant one in your yard and contribute to making sure that these plants are still around. So yerba mansa fits into that category. The whole plant is used medicinally, but mainly the root is where the medicinal compounds are concentrated. It's used primarily as an antibacterial, antifungal, for wounds, sores, ulcers, and chronic inflamed mucous membranes. The famous herbalist Michael Moore says that it's one of the best for chronic congested, inflamed, or infected conditions of the mouth, lungs, upper and lower gastrointestinal tracts, and the urinary tract. So it works throughout the body when taken internally, but it's often used topically as an antibacterial wash. It contains 38 compounds that are, as I said, mostly concentrated in the root. And the essential oil contains compounds that are antibacterial and antifungal, which the plant needs because it grows in wet places where fungi or funguses are likely to be. So very often what you find with the plants is that these concentrated compounds that humans have found can be used medicinally are created by the plant, not just to give us a gift of some medicine, but to protect the plants from diseases themselves, from bacteria, from viruses, from fungi. The primary compound in yerba mansa is something called methyl eugenol. It's an aromatic compound, and it's found in over 450 different plants. It's very common in the plant world. Let me read you a list of a few of the plants that have methyl eugenol. California bay, cumin, fennel, anise, peppermint, sage, thyme, yarrow, chamomile, tarragon, sassafras, cinnamon, nutmeg, scented geraniums, eucalyptus, tea tree, mango, banana, and papaya, to name just a few. And those are all, if you think about them, they're all aromatic in some way. So that's one of the clues to medicinal properties of plants. If you can smell something really strong in it, it's probably got some medicine in it. All right, so that's our first plant, yerba mansa, Anemopsis californica. Now, in the nursery trade, they go by the scientific names, the Latin names. And in my book I do too, because that is really the only way to make a positive identification. All these plants have common names. If I tell you that this is bee sage right here, well, you'll say, well, I've never heard of bee sage. Well, that's one of the common names of white sage, because its Latin name has the word apia in it, which comes from the bee. So, and bees love it. But so my point is that plants can have many common names, and there's no such thing as a wrong common name. So scientists, horticulturalists, and authors like myself, we use the scientific names to be sure we know what we're talking about. Yes, so questions about yerba mansa or anything I've talked about so far?
Just in general, those of us who are now wanting to switch to the natives for landscaping purposes, could you describe the flowers and
Yes, sure.
how it looks all year long?
Yes, and let me just say that any questions that you might have that I don't address, they're all in the book too. So yerba mansa has beautiful white flowers. They develop red spots on them as they age, but it's not unattractive. They're kind of speckled with red spots as they get older, but they're really bright white petals, and they have a the center part of the flower rises up out of the petals. It's a low-growing plant. The flower stalks rarely get more than 2 feet high, so it's like a bedding plant. There's a garden in Ojai called the Earth Island Medicinal Garden, something like that. I can't remember the exact name. Anyway, it's an amazing garden. You should look it up online, Earth Island Garden in Ojai. And she has plants from, this is Carol Wade, a local herbalist. She has plants from around the world that have medicinal properties, and the garden is organized by the lungs, the kidneys, the brain, like that. So she has a big patch of yerba mansa, and we're talking the east end of Ojai. Full sun, gets really hot, but she has a water supply, and she gives that yerba mansa patch plenty of water. If you're dealing with the drought and you're trying to plant more drought-tolerant plants, this is not the one. Yes?
I just wanted to mention there are some beautiful colonies of yerba mansa at the settling ponds right by the Ventura Harbor. If you want to see them and you can go in the spring, beautiful. I mean, really beautiful. I highly recommend it.
Did you all hear that? There are some beautiful patches of yerba mansa at the settling ponds near the marina. Is that right?
Yeah, harbor.
Yeah. So find out where that is and go check that out. Yeah, there are still colonies of yerba mansa, and as I said, you're not going to find one yerba mansa plant out in nature. It's a colony plant. You're going to find lots of them in a big patch. And also, that's a reminder, if you plant it in your garden, any of the colony plants that I mentioned, like mugwort, we're going to get to, another colony plant, they like to grow. They like to send their rhizomes out and spread, and they'll take over your yard. So Green Thumb sells something called a root barrier. It's a piece of plastic. It's about a foot deep. And you surround your colony plants with that if you want to contain them into a certain area. Okay, any other questions about yerba mansa? Okay, moving on to the muskroot family. I had never heard of the muskroot family until recently because elderberry, our next plant, used to be in the honeysuckle family. And then he's looking for the elderberry tree, I think, right now. Got an elderberry for us? And in going back to the early 90s, DNA research made its entrance into botany, as it did also into, for example, forensic science. Positive identifications of criminals and of bodies are done with DNA now. And when DNA hit the world of botany, there was a upheaval in the classifying of these plants, because it turned out this plant wasn't related to that plant, or it wasn't really in this family over here. So there was a wholesale renaming and reclassifying, which was just fantastic for me, not, because I had learned all these families and names, and the family names used to tell you something about the family. The names used to tell you something about the plant. Now they're usually named after a person, and it's just a whole different thing. Anyway, this is the muskroot family now. Adoxaceae is the Latin name of the muskroot family. It's a small family. It was broken off from the honeysuckle family. There's just 5 genuses, 5 genera within that family, and 220 species worldwide. 20 of those species are Sambucus, which is the elderberry that Richard is carrying around right now. Elderberries are native, as are basically all the plants that I'm talking about today are native California plants, meaning what? What does that mean, that they're native? They originated in this area. So in other words, if you go back 500 years and that plant was here, then we call it a native. After that, anything goes. I mean, there's so many plants that came from Europe and Australia, South Africa, South America. So there are many non-native plants, but back at that time when only the Chumash were living here, there were what we call now the native plants. So elderberry, though, interestingly, is found around the entire world in the northern hemisphere, and wherever it's found, it's considered a native to that place. So how could that be? It kind of defies the logic of the whole idea of naming something a native. Well, it turns out, apparently, humans have been carrying elderberry around with them for tens of thousands of years. Our ancestors, in their migrations, have always had elderberry and several other plants, some of which we'll be talking about today, that were essential to have in their medicine chest. And so that is one explanation for why it's considered a native in so many places. Elderberry is deciduous, so it's a perennial, it's a tree or a shrub, and it keeps on growing, but it's deciduous, meaning that it loses its leaves in the wintertime. It will, in nature, you often see it as a shrub because it burns, and then after it burns, lots of sprouts come up from the mother plant, and you end up with a shrub. But if you plant one elderberry in your yard, you will have an elderberry tree. And they rarely reach full size and full age in nature because of fires, because we have so many fires. But there is an elderberry tree that I've seen on the banks of Lake Casitas, and I hope it's still there since the lake shrunk. But the trunk of this tree, like, I'm not exaggerating. I can't even put my arms around how big the trunk of that elderberry tree is. So many of these shrubs that we see in the mountains will become trees if they don't burn to the ground. And then they have strategies for coming back. So it's all good. So elderberry trees, they're very easy to grow in that they are drought tolerant. They can tolerate all different kinds of soil. You'll find them typically in the river valleys, like the Ventura River, all the way up on both sides of the river. But they don't have to be right near the water, like some trees like sycamores and white alders. They need to be right by the water. Elderberries you don't find right by the water, but they're generally in those bigger floodplains, like the 500 and 1,000 year floodplains. So they like that kind of silt, but they'll grow in sandy soil, they'll grow in clayey soil, and once they're established, they don't need water. So birds love them because of all the berries they make. And if you learn to harvest them between you and the birds, that should take care of the berries. If you don't do that, and if the birds don't come to your house, maybe you've got too many cats or something, then you're going to end up with purple polka dots all over your walkways and everything underneath your elderberry tree. They can be very messy if the berries aren't eaten. But I suggest this. I'm going to just take a show of hands. How many of you have heard of elderberry as a medicinal plant? So almost every hand in the crowd. This is probably the most publicized medicinal herb these days. It's huge. Yes, sir.
Is wine medicinal?
Yes, elderberry wine is medicinal. Wine was one of the earliest ways that people learned to preserve fruits, and including their medicinal properties. So I won't get into any more detail about how much wine any person should drink. I'll leave that up to you. But yes, elderberry wine, elderberry syrup, elderberry gummies, you name it. You can get elderberry in all kinds of forms. Or you can grow your own elderberry tree and make your own elderberry juice and make syrup from that, and even make candy from it if you want. The possibilities for home crafting with these plants is limitless. So elderberry is used primarily as an antiviral, and this you may know if you've heard of elderberry, and you see it now in many different vitamin combinations for colds and flus. And there is sufficient evidence now, and it's cited in my book, numerous studies proving that elderberry flower tea or elderberry syrup made from the berries can prevent, stop, or reduce the amount of time of the common cold and the common flu, the annual influenza. It's being researched as a possible treatment for COVID-19 because COVID-19 is a coronavirus and the common cold is also a coronavirus. They're different. The COVID-19 is a novel coronavirus, but still there's enough evidence to say, yeah, we should be looking at that. So, of course, the FDA is funding studies. I'm just kidding. But individual researchers and, progressive universities are doing research into this. A lot of this research happens in other countries because the pharmaceutical lobby is so powerful in our country that they do tend to shut down anything that they can't make a maximum profit from. But I'm getting up on my soapbox. And my book does start with a chapter called A Brief History of Medicinal Herbs in America that explains exactly what happened 100 years ago when herbs were removed from the U.S. pharmacopoeia, where they made up most of the drugs before that point. And then something significant happened, and I won't get into that now, but I just say that I did address it in my book. So in addition to working as an antiviral, elderberry also is a diaphoretic. That means that it stimulates sweating. When you have a fever, that's your body's way of fighting an infection, whether it's a bacterial infection, a viral infection. These organisms live within a certain temperature range that they like, just like we like a certain temperature range. It's actually kind of comfortable today, but 40 degrees out here, you'd at least be wearing a jacket, if not, home with the heater on. So these diseases are the same way, and the body raises the temperature, not enough to kill you, but enough to kill the virus, the bacteria. And then the sweating releases the toxins that have been created from the waste products of these disease organisms. That's what gets you, is their waste products. So so that's how diaphoretics work, and that's how elderberry works as a hot tea of the flowers. But as far as an antiviral, there's a protein in the flowers and the fruits that can bind directly to a virus and neutralize the viral protein that the virus is using to attach to your lung cells. It also can block the virus from attaching to the immune system cells in your lungs, your own immune system cells that are there to fight viruses. The viruses have ways to attack those cells, and elderberry has a way to block the viruses from attacking those cells. And again, this has been documented now. So I think given our time, I could go on and on about elderberry, but and on my website, by the way, did I tell you my website? herbwalks.com. You can remember that, right? Say it out loud to yourself. herbwalks.com. Now you will remember it. And I have a blog. I don't blog that often, but when I do, I've blogged about elderberry, about the whole process of how to harvest and prepare and make the elderberry juice from which you can make other products. Yes? She asked, is it full sun? Typically, yes. It'll stand a little partial shade, but basically you want to plant elderberries in full sun. Pretty much, other than a few shade plants like the currants and the gooseberries that like to be in the shade, most plants that make fruit like to be in the sun. Okay, good question. Yes?
You say full sun, how many hours a day is that?
How many hours a day? Those kinds of questions probably better for the nursery staff because it also depends where you live. I mean, there's UV rays coming through right now, but there's fog here, so it's different than Ojai, where there's clear blue sky right now, and it's going to get 20 degrees hotter today. So it really depends also where you live. But generally, sun all day is what. When you see elderberries in nature, that's where you typically see them. They like to be in the sun. Okay, any other questions about elderberry? Yes. Oh, good question. Does the book tell you how to use the plants medicinally? Okay, so, and she said the first one I mentioned was the root, so you're going to ruin your plant. Okay, so first of all, yes, each plant description includes information either in the text about how to use the plant, or in the back of the book there are recipes which go into even more detail about how to use the plants. As far as the root, well, I said yerba mansa is a colony plant. It's going to have, you're going to have 100 plants there before you know it. So you can afford to take a few plants out and thin out your patch, and then you've got some roots. And the book also goes into how to process the roots. You get the dirt off of them, etc. There's a whole section in the front of the book, just a general section on gathering plants, on processing plants, on the different ways to take plants as infusions, decoctions, ointments, how to make all those things. Okay, great questions. Any more before we move on to our next plant? Okay. We're now going to move to the second largest family of plants on planet Earth, the sunflower family, also known as the daisy family. But now that the name has been changed, it's more correct to call it the aster family, because the Latin name is Asteraceae. This is the second largest family of plants on the planet. Anybody know what's the largest? When I say largest, I mean the most plants within that family. What's the largest family? Quiz time. Grasses. Good guess. No, but good guess. Sage is in the mint family, which is a large family, but not the biggest. I heard somebody say it. The orchid family. I know, nobody here in Southern California would guess that, right? Are you an orchid aficionado? Okay, yeah. So orchids primarily are in the tropical rainforests, right? And if you think about the planet, what's the biggest circumference? Where is that area? Around the equator. So there's a lot of forest, a lot of rainforest there. And as a result, orchids are the most plentiful family on the planet. But the sunflower family comes in second, Asteraceae. They're known for having a composite flower, meaning that they have a center of the flower with disc flowers. And think of a sunflower as I'm talking about this. You've got the sunflowers, before the seeds come, you have the yellow center, which is made up of lots of little disc flowers. And then you have the yellow ray flowers, the petals, what we think of as the petals coming out around those. Those are two different kinds of flowers within the same flower, and that's called a composite flower. And this family used to be Compositae, which gave me a wonderful story to explain the family. Now it's Asteraceae. So yeah, it's named after an aster flower. So what? Anyway, yeah, if I sound a little bitter about all this, yes, I am. But you know what? It's good for your brain to have to keep learning new things. It really is. Okay, so the first, alphabetically, the first plant in this family, Richard, you ready? Is Achillea millefolium. Interesting name. Achillea is named for the Greek legendary warrior Achilles, who used this plant, according to legend, to treat the wounds of his soldiers. It has been known since the Greeks, and before that among indigenous people, as a plant that will stop bleeding. Unfortunately, Achilles had what we call the Achilles heel. It's really the Achilles tendon, okay, right above the heel. His mother held him by that part of his foot and dipped him in some special water that protected him, so he could not be harmed, except right there, because that's where she was holding on to him. And that was his Achilles heel, and that's where he got shot with an arrow. And I guess he didn't have any yarrow with him at the time, and he died from that. And the millifolium part of the name, milla from 1,000, folia leaves, so 1,000 leaves right there, tiny little dissected leaves. So that's the story of that name. I like these name stories, and I cover all that in the book too. So yarrow is drought tolerant, but it likes water. So you can use it as a lawn substitute, and I've seen it used very effectively as a lawn substitute, using a lot less water than a lawn. But if you want to do that with it, it's going to need some water. In nature, it will grow around here, it likes to grow in sort of north-facing canyons, kind of shadier places. It's really more of a northern plant, but it's found places it can grow in Southern California. So you can grow it probably in partial shade or even in total shade. It'll grow in Southern California. But you'll probably want to give it some water to keep it looking fresh all year. I'll take the questions after I finish about yarrow, okay? I'll do that for each plant. So it's the plant itself is very low growing. This part right here, that's about as tall as it's going to get. And you can cut it back, you can mow it. And keep it as a lawn. Then it sends up flower stalks about that high with tight clusters of white flowers called umbels. Very attractive. It's also aromatic, and I'll talk about what's in it in a minute. Let's see. Yeah. So yarrow is another one of those plants like elderberry that is considered native wherever it's found growing in the northern hemisphere. There's 5 plants that fit that description. That's elderberry, yarrow, mugwort, which we also have, chamomile, and stinging nettles. Those 5 are considered native wherever they're found, and they're found all around the globe in the northern hemisphere, presumably because people have been using them. And speaking of that, so yarrow, this is really interesting. Some anthropologists, or archaeologists, I guess, in Spain were studying the remains of Neanderthal skulls and skeletons, 50,000-year-old human ancestors. And they were looking to determine what the people were eating. So they were studying the crusted calculus on their teeth and looking for plant material. And they were finding all various kinds of edible plants. But they also found yarrow and chamomile. Well, I don't know if you've ever tried to eat yarrow leaves or eat chamomile leaves. That's not something you would serve in a salad, okay, trust me. So the only explanation the researchers could come up with was that these 50,000 year ago, no such thing, people were self-medicating with yarrow, and chamomile was the other plant that they found in their teeth. So there's some evidence that humans have been using this plant for a very long time, not just to stop wounds from bleeding, but any kind of internal bleeding, including excess menstrual bleeding for women. But it has a long history of being used for wound treatment, especially. And yarrow contains alkaloids, typically bitter when they're found in plants. And the alkaloids that are in yarrow have been shown to be hemostatic, meaning that they increase the coagulation of blood. They speed up coagulation of blood. So that's what you want when you're trying to stop bleeding, right? And also there's a high tannin content in yarrow. Tannin we mostly associate with oaks, and I'll be getting to the oaks. I better watch the time here. Oh no, we're doing okay. I'll be getting to tannin in oaks and about how you have to leach the tannin out of acorns before you can eat them. That's because tannin is very astringent. People describe that taste as bitter, but actually it's not. It's astringent, which is a taste in itself. It's the taste if you've ever eaten a persimmon that wasn't quite ready. You know that? It's more like a feeling, like a puckering feeling in your mouth, like someone just scoured out the inside of the lining of your mouth. That's astringent. And that's what, but astringency comes from tannin, and astringency of tannins, I should say, which are astringent, they tighten up tissue. They cause the proteins in tissues to come closer together and squeeze the water out. So that's kind of how they work, and that helps with wound healing and wound cleansing as well. Okay. So that was our first plant from the sunflower family, Achillea millefolium. Well, we have a question here, and there's another question over there.
You said that yarrow like shade is planted in the sun.
Yes, but you have to water it. You're gonna have, it's not.
You can't plant it in full sun?
Yes, you can. Well, it depends. In Ojai, I wouldn't plant it in full sun. I'd have to give it just too much water. Where I've seen it successful in Ojai is in partial shade, or almost complete shade. Yeah, it's gonna need a lot of water, and that's not practical for most of us these days. Yeah, so I think of it as a shade, more as a shade plant. But if you have like a lawn area, under oaks, never water within 8 feet of your oak tree, though, your live oaks, and I'll get into that. But other than that, you can grow yarrow.
So if you want to grow it as a ground cover, does it spread or you have to
Yeah, question, if you want to grow it as a ground cover, does it spread? No, it's not a colony plant that spreads like the mugwort. You just have to seed a lot of it and grow a lot of it. And there was a question over here.
Yeah, the plant actually grows low. It's the flower that gets tall.
Yeah, the plant is low growing, the flowers get tall. So if you can, you water it, you get it growing real healthy, make some nice flower stalks. The flowers are the medicinal part, so you wait until the flowers are ready to harvest, then you can harvest the flowers and then you can cut it back, or even mow it, with a higher setting on a mower, and make it work like a lawn. I wouldn't try to play soccer on it, but it serves a lot of the other lawn purposes. Okay, any other questions on yarrow? Okay, moving along. Our next plant from the sunflower family is coastal sagebrush. And do we have both kinds here? Yeah, okay. So we have the native common Artemisia californica. Common, either it's called California sage because its name is Artemisia californica, or we more commonly call it coastal sage because this one grows on the ocean side of our coastal range. And once you get on the other side, like Rose Valley and the Sespe, and all the way to the Rocky Mountains, that's the Great Basin. And there's a Great Basin sagebrush that grows over there. But this is our coastal sagebrush, and there's a variety that I think came from the Channel Islands, because a lot of the plants on the islands, because of all the wind, they're very low-growing plants. They just evolved. They figured out, I'm not going to keep sticking my limbs up into that wind and get them knocked down. I'm just going to stay low to the ground. So we have these cultivars, like the Artemisia californica Canyon Gray cultivar, which are low-growing. So you can grow this as like a bedding plant, however you would grow something low-growing. It's not something you grow for the flowers. Look, there's the flowers. Well, this is October. I know, the absent-minded professor. That's all you get for flowers, okay? Not much to write home about. But let me take that around. We don't have the time right now for everybody to come up and rub on this plant, but trust me, this is a very aromatic plant, extremely aromatic. It has like 15 monoterpenoids, which are the ingredients that make up the essential oil of a plant, the terpenes. And its nickname is Cowboy Cologne for that reason. Because the cowboys, when they came off the range, that's what they would smell like. Or they would intentionally rub themselves down with that plant before they headed to the saloon when they got back into town.
Very small.
So I think these little names help us remember something about the plants. That is definitely an aromatic plant. It's found mainly in Southern California, and as I said, on the ocean side of the Coast Range. And it's one of the foundation plants of the plant family called the coastal sage scrub plant community. The coastal sage scrub plant community, which is made up of sagebrush and several sages: white sage, black sage, purple sage, and another plant we're going to get to, buckwheat. Those are the dominant plants of that plant community. And if you were to look at this spot right here 500 years ago, that's probably what you would see growing right here, those plants, because we're in that coastal sage scrub plant community right here. I know it's hard to tell because there's a lot of things from all over the world here at the moment, but that is the native habitat. So it's totally adapted to growing around here. It's drought tolerant, but the thing about it is that it goes into summer dormancy. Most of our deciduous plants that we think of as deciduous, trees that lose their leaves, that's winter dormancy. They're going dormant in the winter because they don't want to deal with trying to stay alive through the snow and the cold weather. But a lot of our native plants in this Mediterranean climate with these long, hot, dry summers, they go into summer dormancy. They make their seeds and they go, I'm done. I'm not going to waste my time trying to keep moisture in my leaves and fight this heat. I'm just going to shut down, and I don't care what I look like. I've done my thing. I've had my moment in the sun. And so coastal sagebrush is one of those. If you give it some water, it'll stay green through the year. But if you don't, go out on a hike and see what it looks like right now. It's yellow and dry, and it looks dead. It's not. It's just dormant. But it kind of doesn't look that great. So, one of the things that the staff here can tell you about is as you're planning your larger native plant garden, you need to think about what's going to flower at this time of year, what's going to flower at that time of year, what's going to look good now, what am I going to cut back in November, and is there something else that'll kind of be coming up at that time to fill in that space when I've cut back my Matilla poppies, those kinds of things. I'm not a landscaper. I do have native plants, and I've been an organic gardener since 1968, but I'm not a professional landscaper, so I'm not the last word on that aspect. Okay, so the leaves and stems are the part that's used medicinally. But let me say right away, this plant contains a compound called thujone, which can be toxic in quantities, in excess dosage. So it's not a plant to drink a strong tea out of. My Chumash teacher told us that the young women drank a weak tea of the sagebrush leaves from the time they started puberty until they had their first child. It was considered part of a whole long-term cleansing process to get their body ready to have a child. And it was also used, throughout, women used it throughout life. But not as a strong tea. This is something that you would take very carefully, and you would never make like an alcohol tincture of this plant and take that. I generally advise against making tinctures with alcohol of plants unless you're a trained herbalist, because the potential when you have something that concentrated to hurt yourself is very high. Any substance that's strong enough to have a positive medicinal effect on your body is also strong enough to harm you. So a weak tea, but the real place where this plant shines is as a liniment for treating pain. A liniment made with alcohol, but not to be drunk, for treating pain. And I mentioned that it has terpenes. The monoterpenoids are what you smell when you rub a peppermint leaf, when you rub a sage leaf, when you rub the yerba santa or the sagebrush. It's the monoterpenes that you're smelling. And the monoterpenes in sagebrush can interact directly with the pain receptors in the skin, going through the skin when applied as a liniment. And this happens without taking a drug that, like an opioid, that goes to your brain and creates addiction. There is no addiction involved. It's topical, and it's an amazing process. And the science behind it is described in my book. It's been studied and proven that it can do that. It goes straight through the skin to the pain receptors, because that's where we feel pain, is in our skin. We don't feel pain in our brain. When you stub your toe, you don't grab your head and go, "Ow, that hurts," right? You grab your knee, your toe, wherever the pain is. So anyway, that's sagebrush. Questions? Yes.
If you ran on the trail and you hurt yourself, how would you use it?
Okay. Not really. I suppose. Okay, well, let me say first, before I answer that. Indigenous people like the Chumash, who are still among us, traditionally, they didn't have pharmacies in modern medicine. So they used plants as antibiotics, antibacterial, antiviral. We have other things now today. We know today, for example, that if you put a wild plant, unwashed wild plant, directly on an open wound, you're likely to introduce bacteria into that wound. Even if it's an antibacterial plant, there might be other bacteria on the plant. So that's a first aid only kind of situation, where you would put a wild plant straight onto your skin, or especially onto an open scrape or bruise or wound. So that being said, I guess if I had to try to use it for pain, I would probably chew some up and then spit that out and spread it on it. The Chumash used bear grease or whale oil to make an ointment with it for pain. We have found in modern times that alcohol works even better. And this liniment, you just put it in a spray bottle and you spray it right on wherever it hurts. And it's really pretty amazing. If you've sprayed it on there 3 or 4 times, the skin becomes numb over the area and the pain goes away. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. Okay, yeah, she asked, what about for cleansing space, for burning? That's a process called smudging. Sagebrush is one of the herbs that is used for smudging. Smudging is mostly considered like a spiritual practice of cleansing the spiritual body, cleansing the aura. But a study done in India on medicinal herbs that were burned as incense or burned as smudge in India found that they actually killed bacteria if they were burned in an enclosed space. They killed bacteria in the room, which is pretty amazing. So, it does go beyond just cleansing the spiritual body. This is a plant. Sagebrush has always been considered a cleansing, purifying plant wherever it's found. And we're in an era of rediscovering these plants, rediscovering the uses, and any one of you could become the next plant pharmacologist that discovers some new use for these plants. I mean, the field is wide open, so go for it. Start growing them and get to know the plants. Go out in nature, go on an herb walk with me, or just go take a hike and get out into nature and start experiencing these plants, smelling what you smell around you, and rubbing the plants. There's no plant I can think of besides poison oak or stinging nettles or a cactus that's going to hurt you just by touching the plant. Even poisonous plants like datura, you can rub the leaves and go, oh, that smells like peanut butter. Datura leaves do smell like peanut butter, but it's extremely toxic to ingest it. But you can safely go out in nature and rub up against things and smell things and start, or continue reconnecting with nature. And this is just when you start growing the plants and processing them and having them in your cupboard, now you're taking it to the next level. Okay, well, we're going to move on to a very close cousin of sagebrush, same genus, Artemisia, named for Artemis, the Greek goddess of wild nature, the moon, and childbirth, and associated with other things too, hunting, the forest, the nature goddess, I guess you could call her. Artemisia californica was the California sagebrush or the coastal sagebrush. Our next plant is Artemisia douglassiana, named for a Scottish botanist whose last name was Douglas. And this is mugwort. How many of you have heard of mugwort before? Oh, that's a pretty sizable. So, yeah, what do you know about mugwort?
It spreads.
Anything? Yell some things out. What have you heard about mugwort? It's a native, yeah.
It spreads.
It spreads. It's a colony plant. Yes. What's that?
He said put it under your pillow.
Put it under your pillow. It's a dream enhancing plant. There's no scientific documentation of that, but there are lots of anecdotal stories of people using mugwort that way to either initiate dreaming, because if you don't dream at all, you could have mental problems. Dreaming is important. It's an important part of our daily psychic life. If you don't dream, then you probably are going to have some issues, especially with healing, emotional healing. So mugwort can stimulate dreaming, or it can also enhance dreaming by putting some fresh stalks in a pillowcase or wrapping up in a bandana or something, and then putting that under your pillow, so somewhere, or even hanging it over your head in bed, so you're smelling it while you're sleeping. So yes, that's one of the more mystical uses of mugwort. Anything else that you know about mugwort? It's like sagebrush. It's considered a cleansing plant. Yeah, and so it's burned also as a smudge. It's widely used in China in acupuncture. It's called moxibustion. Can I see some hands? Anyone heard of moxibustion or moxa? Okay, a little more esoteric. This is where the dried brown leaves of mugwort, which, well, there's a couple here. Yeah, there you go. So mugwort, most plants, when the leaves die, they drop off on the ground. On mugwort and sagebrush, the dry, dead leaves hang on the plant and they just turn brown. So these brown leaves, you'll see that there's almost like fur on the back side of the leaves. They're very fibrous. They're crushed up and made into a ball for primitive fire making. So when you're using a hand drill or a bow drill to start a fire in the primitive way, and you get a little coal going, you put the coal in a bed of these mugwort leaves, and it just smolders in there. And you can keep it smoldering for a while you're getting your fire going, or you can even carry the fire with you somewhere else by using the mugwort. But in Chinese medicine, they make cones out of this mugwort, dried mugwort leaves, and they burn that on the acupuncture points to warm the points. It's a part of the using heat as a treatment in Chinese medicine to burn mugwort, or it's put on the ends of the needles to warm the needles. But the smoke that comes off that burning is very, very pleasant, very aromatic, and very calming. So it's part of the treatment is inhaling that smoke. Not that you should, enclose yourself in a closet and just breathe smoke all day, but breathing some of that smoke can be an important part of the process of receiving an acupuncture treatment. All right, so we've established that it's a colony plant. What I didn't hear anybody say is about where you find it growing. Where do you find mugwort in nature? In the riparian habitat. And what is that? What is the riparian habitat? By creeks, by water. By creeks, streams, rivers, lakes, near water. If you go hiking in a canyon, you're in Southern California and there's any water or there has been water in the winter, you're likely to find coast live oak trees growing in that canyon. Does that sound familiar? And on the ground, under those oak trees, you're going to find these colony plants. Mugwort, blackberry, hummingbird sage, and the most famous of all, poison oak. And it turns out that this calming effect, healing effect that mugwort has is very effective for treating the poison oak rash. It's not going to necessarily prevent you from getting the poison oak rash. The best way to do that is wash the poison oak oil off your skin as soon as you know you've made contact with it. If you can wash it off within 30 minutes, you won't get the rash. But if you get the rash, and before you scratch the rash into this blistering, oozy mess, you can put fresh mugwort leaves ground up with a little water, squeeze that green juice onto your rash, and it's amazing. Like in the same way that the sagebrush treats pain, the mugwort treats the itching of the poison oak rash. It stops the itching, which is pretty much the whole battle right there. Because if you can stop it from itching, then you're not going to be rubbing it in your sleep or scratching it during the day, and it'll likely go away. So it's the leaves and stems that are used both externally and internally. Internally, again, as I mentioned, for the sagebrush, it's considered a women's herb used for menstrual cramps, PMS, suppressed menstruation, so various things that I've only heard about through hearsay, but that women know about. And the Asteraceae family, the sunflower family, includes a lot of the plants include terpenes, not monoterpenes that are the ones that are so aromatic. This one does have monoterpenes that gives it its aroma, but they have sesquiterpenes. You have monoterpenes, sesquiterpenes, diterpenes, triterpenes, etc. The more complex the terpene molecules get, they get more complicated names, but they're all oil-like compounds that give the plants protection against being eaten or protection against diseases, and turns out are medicinal for humans. So this plant has sesquiterpene lactones that can bring down the body temperature in menopause and relieve the pain of a suppressed menstrual period. They also have shown, I'm going to read you a list of biological activity found in these sesquiterpenes, according to research. Anti-tumor, anti-inflammatory, analgesic, pain relieving, anti-ulcer, antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, antiparasitic, and insect deterrent. And mugwort is able to provide a lot of those. It also has monoterpenes like camphor, eucalyptol, thujone that give it its aroma. Okay, you saw the flowers such as they are on the, so not exactly a sunflower, is it? No, that's what you get on a mugwort plant also. You would hardly even notice that it was flowering. That's just pretty much exactly what mugwort flowers look like. I planted a mugwort patch just by harvesting the dried flowers. I tried to find the seeds. I couldn't find the seeds. I had to get a magnifying glass to see the seeds. They were really funny shape in there, kind of like little tridents like Neptune would carry. little tridents, tiny, tiny microscopic things. So I just got a whole handful of that and just spread it out in a flat and watered it. And I had a whole flat full of little mugwort plants coming up and transplanted them into a shady place in the garden. Yes.
In your book, do you talk about like dosage or techniques, for example, for some of these medicinal plants?
Yes. So the question was similar to a previous question. In the book, do I describe the amounts, the dosage, etc., how to prepare these plants to take them? Yes, I do. Either in the text of that individual plant, or in some cases, there's a recipe in the back. Or if the text says to make an infusion of the leaves, then you look in the front of the book in the section on general how to use plants, and you'll see that an infusion is when you steep a plant in boiled water. You don't cook it. That's a decoction. When you boil a plant, that's a decoction. When you just pour boiled water on it, put a lid on it, and let it sit there, that's an infusion. That's steeping the plant. So they're different. There's reasons why you use different methods for all these different plants, and that's all explained in the book. Okay, that's it for mugwort. And believe me, I could go on. This is such an amazing plant, but I won't. So, any more questions about mugwort? Okay, good. Either I covered everything or you're already starting to nod off. Well, we'll find out. The next plant, still in the sunflower family, again, I told you it's the second biggest family in the world, is goldenrod, solidago. This just simply does not tell you what goldenrod is going to look like when it flowers. It's a very tall plant. It will grow up to 5 feet high. It's another colony plant, so it spreads like the mugwort, and this, not the sagebrush, but like the mugwort, it spreads by rhizomes. So you'll see big patches of goldenrod with bright, bright yellow flowers. Really bright. I don't see that quite that bright, but as bright as you can imagine a bright yellow, that's how bright goldenrod is. I know it's called goldenrod. I think it should be yellow rod because it's sort of a golden yellow. But in any case, really easy to recognize once you know what it looks like. It has very thin racemes of these bright yellow flowers at the tops of the stem. So it puts up, it's a tall plant, and then it puts up tall stems, even taller than the plant, and the flowers are at the top of the stems. It can flower anytime between June and November, depending on where it's growing or where you live. And as I said, you're going to have a different growing season here in Ventura in the fog than you're going to have up in Ojai, or even different from up further up Rose Valley or up toward Pine Mountain. We have different zones, and then within those zones are microclimates. You might have a little different climate than your neighbor. Just odd things. The shade, the moisture from certain trees, creates microclimates as well. So the flowering tops, including whatever leaves or younger leaves or smaller leaves are up there with the flowers, that's the part that's harvested, and it's used more for external use, for disinfecting and healing sores, again for the astringent properties that are often found in this family, for treating wounds and burns, but also modern herbalists use it for inflammation of the urinary tract. And the way it works is like a diuretic. Okay, you know what a diuretic is? Increases urine flow. But the problem with diuretics is that as you're increasing urine flow, you're not just losing water, you're losing electrolytes, right? Those are the minerals that are essential for your body to function. Calcium, potassium, going back and forth across membranes in your body are what makes the nervous system happen, what makes muscles relax after you exercise a muscle. goldenrod is what's called an aquaretic. It's a type. It's a type of diuretic that does not lose the electrolytes. So it's a better type of diuretic, and that's what goldenrod is basically. So it's not as widely used as some of these other plants that we've talked about, but I included it in my book because it's a really iconic wild California plant that's easy to identify and has this unique property of being an aquaretic. So Richard is, again, he's passing around a very young goldenrod plant. You'll have to allow for this plant right here to start spreading. You can eventually have a patch of goldenrod as long as you have your root barrier around it so it doesn't take over your yard. But there are worse things to take over your yard than goldenrod. It's a beautiful plant. Okay, questions about goldenrod? Yes? When she thinks of goldenrod, she thinks of allergies. So yes, this family, the sunflower family, has many plants that people are allergic to. Like people are allergic to sagebrush. Ragweed, is another plant that's in this family. It would be the pollen. Typically, it's the pollen that you're allergic to in a plant. So yeah, you could be allergic to any one of these plants. I'm not an allergist, so, and even they can't tell by looking at you what you're allergic to. They have a whole series of painful tests they do to determine what you're allergic to. Question? This is a drought-tolerant plant. Yeah, once it's established, you won't need to water it. But if you do water it, you'll get bigger, greener plants with bigger flower clusters. It will take some water, but it doesn't need it. What I do with water with my native plants, and I think this is the way to go, is, I'll take your question in a minute. You water natives at the beginning and the end of the rainy season. So, or during the rainy season. So come January, if we haven't had much rain, that's the time to water your native plants. During the time of year that they're used to getting water anyway. These plants have co-evolved with, or evolved, I should say, with this Mediterranean climate that we all live in here. If we live in Southern California, in this area, we're in the Mediterranean climate. If you're in Ventura, you're in a cool Mediterranean climate. If you're in Ojai, you're in a hot Mediterranean climate. It's still the Mediterranean climate, meaning we have long, dry summers, like an annual drought, and then we have short, relatively mild winters. And that's when we get 90% of our rain is during those few months in the winter, and that's when you want to water your natives. So come the spring, if we haven't had enough rain, that's when you want to give them the water, in March, even into April. But then once the summer drought hits, you don't water natives. There's some that can handle it, but some do not like it. They will die if you give them too much water in the summer. They're just not, that's not how they've evolved. So I hope that helps with sort of a general idea of the drought tolerance of these plants. Oh, by the way, in my book, I have many links. In fact, I have 350 citations in this book. Now, when I told my publisher that I had 350 citations, they said, "Oh, we don't do citations in field guides. Sorry, that's for textbooks." And I went, "Well, sorry, but you're going to have to for this one because you wanted me to write a book about medicinal herbs. How can I prove they're medicinal if I don't cite all the studies that have shown their medicinal properties?" So they agreed. They really were a great publisher to work with. So one of the websites that I link to is calscape.org. You can write that down in your notes right now. calscape.org. This is the best. We are so lucky in California to have groups like the California Native Plant Society, University of California, etc., that have compiled so much information and made it available to the public for free. So the California Native Plant Society has this website devoted to growing native plants. They have lists of every native plant nursery in the state, And I do too on my website, every native plant nursery in Southern California. And some of those nurseries publish weekly inventories of what they have in stock. But the CalScape website will tell you everything you need to know about growing these plants in your yard and which Sunset Magazine zone they're going to be, happy in, etc. So that's a good one to know about. One of many links. And in case I forget later, if you get my book, one of the things I hate about citations in a book is when they're a link to a website. And I'm looking at the book and I see there's like 150 characters in this website name. How do I get that into my computer? I have to sit there and go back and forth from the page to, right? So I created on my website a hyperlinked bibliography for the book. So if you want to look up any of the sources in the book, just go to that page on my website and you just click on it and boom, it opens up. So I did that for myself, but you get to benefit from it too, because that's one of my pet peeves about books. Okay.
She has a question.
Yes, your question. Thank you.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
You said they're mature. You need to water them until they're mature.
I was saying if you wanted to have a really big, beautiful patch, you would give it water in the spring to supplement the winter rain. If we get a lot of rain, we have one of those major rain events, then you don't have to do any watering.
And so then my second question is, what's the best way to water drought-tolerant plants? With a drip or?
Okay, excellent question. The question was, what's the best way to water drought-tolerant plants? With a drip or with sprinklers or what? Well, there are many schools of thought on that. And it also gets into, like, your water company might tell you definitely use drip. There's less evaporation, etc. But I'm going to tell you, you want to try to simulate what the plants are experiencing in nature. Do plants get watered by drip irrigation in nature? Well, yeah, the ones that grow right by the creek and they've got their roots down in the water table, you could say that's like getting the water directly to the roots. But otherwise, plants get watered by rain, and rain comes down like a sprinkler. So that's my recommendation. I use a sprinkler for natives.
So the goldenrod, because I was looking it up, it's not a clustering plant, is it? It kind of looked like it was one bunch.
Well, it's a bunch of plants. It's a colony plant.
Oh, it is a colony.
It is a colony plant.
And does it grow to be about 3 feet?
It'll grow to be 5. Well, the plant itself will grow to be 3 feet, but then the flower stalks will be up 5 feet or even higher. I've seen them 6 feet.
Can you propagate them? Cut a little piece off? Well, I guess you don't need to if it's a colony, huh?
Yeah, you would, to propagate it, you would just dig some up and move them around. And they've got rhizomes coming off of them. And the CalScape will answer any questions you have like that I don't cover in my book. Okay, now I'm going to have to speed up the pace because I've been lollygagging around here. Okay. No, I don't want to go on. All right, we're moving to another family, the cactus family. Do you have the opuntias here? Oh yeah, there you go. And what species do you have there? Does it say? Looks like Ficus indica.
Yeah.
Yeah? Oh, okay, that's a Troya. Okay, so this is prickly pear. That's probably how you know it, right? Or if you habla español, nopal, nopales. Very interesting family of plants. They're made up entirely of stems. Everything you see there is a stem. The stems take the form of a pad, and the pads sprout more pads off the edges, or they sprout fruits called tunas in Espanol. But then the pads they turn woody and become stems. So that's why you can see a prickly pear tree. It's like 10 feet high, right? And it's just petrified leaves, petrified pads that have become woody stems. But that's all it really is. It's really interesting. This plant is the original survival food of Native Americans, both in the United States and Mexico. North American natives. Most important survival plant. The second most important food for the traditional Chumash before European contact. Number 1 was acorns. Number 2 was prickly pear. Number 3 we have here is California buckwheat. Prickly pears have been, not surprisingly, they were first researched by Mexican researchers in the 1980s, who found that Mexican people had long been eating the pads, nopales, to treat adult onset diabetes. So they decided to study that. And a couple of articles came out in the late 1980s that were published, and I have links to those articles in my book, and it took me a long time to find them, believe me. And they found that the prickly pear pads, how many of you have eaten nopales? Raise your hand. Oh, wow, I'm impressed. Okay. I eat them regularly, and when you chop them up, you chop up the nopales, you get nopalitos, little nopales. And I could go on about that too, but I won't. On the very young ones I do. Yeah, I look for the youngest pads, and I'll eat the skin. When they get older, then I peel the skin off, because it starts to get like a waxy cellulose coating around the skin, which is, more fiber, but it could be more fiber than you want. Anyway, what the researchers found was that these pads are full of fiber and pectin, and they have it's called a mucopolysaccharide. Okay, so a saccharide is a sugar molecule. A polysaccharide is a kind of a multiple sugar molecule, and a mucopolysaccharide is a mucousy polysaccharide, a slimy, or gelatinous is a nicer word. But if you've ever eaten okra, then you know what I'm talking about. Okay, that's what you'll experience if you eat nopales. It turns out that substance, there's also pectin, which is another substance found in plants, especially apples are known for having pectin. Another substance that what these do is they literally block the absorption of excess glucose into your bloodstream from the intestines. And that's how it is effective for treating type 2 diabetes. Again, you'll have to go to my book for that, but these are so easy to grow. You start with one of these. That's a beautiful specimen right there, by the way. It's got like the Mickey Mouse ears. I like that one. But I started mine just from getting pads from a friend's patch. And I just stuck them in a pot like that. And then they started sprouting new pads off of the original pads. Now some of them are this high. So you start with that, and then as it continues to make new pads, you can break those pads off. Just let the end where you broke it off dry for a couple of days till it seals over, and you can stick that in a pot or stick it straight in the ground. And you can propagate them very easily that way. The one you have right there, there are, let me tell you how many species. There are 150 species of Opuntia. That's the prickly pear genus. 150. Now, the famous horticulturalist Luther Burbank, he developed 60 varieties of spineless prickly pears during his work. He was quite an amazing guy. 60 varieties of spineless prickly pears, because our native prickly pears, would you hold up that cholla? This is not Opuntia. This is a cholla cactus. It's called Cylindropuntia. It's related, but not the same. But the native prickly pears, if you can imagine that, covered with spines like the cholla, that's what the natives look like. So thanks to Luther Burbank, we have these spineless prickly pears that all came from the Mexican Opuntia ficus indica species that are spineless. And there are lots of good reasons to plant those in your yard. If you're going to plant spiny cactus, you've got to have a dedicated space that kids aren't going to get into, that you're not going to be brushing up against, on your way to the gate, etc. Okay, the pads are edible, the fruits are delicious. This is the time of year to harvest the tunas. Raise your hand if you've ever had tunas. They're delicious, aren't they? Lots of seeds, but the seeds they'll just go right through you. They're covered with that mucopolysaccharide stuff, so they just kind of slide on through. Okay. Questions about Opuntia, prickly pear? All right, our next family is the heath family. And the representative here of the heath family is manzanita. Another Spanish name. What does that mean? Little apple. Manzana is apple, manzanita is little apple. Why is it called little apple? Because it makes berries that look like little apples. Except that when they look like little apples, before they're ripe, they don't taste very good. They have to be fully ripe to the point that they've dried on the bush before they're really edible. A lot of people don't know that, and they'll eat a manzanita berry once in their life because they ate one of those little apples, and it's so astringent that you'll never forget it. We've got 60, I think there are approximately 60 species of manzanita. All of them are native to California. This is a very California plant. The varieties that we have here, what do we have here? We've got, this is the Dr. Hurd cultivar. This is Carmel Sur, so this is a low-growing manzanita. They come in all shapes and sizes. Like I say, there's 60 species, and nurseries love them, right? People love them. If you've ever seen a mature manzanita, the bark is just amazing. It's so beautiful. Smooth, reddish color. And because the bark on the wood is so beautiful, some of the species are on the endangered plant list because they were harvested into extinction for the wood, for table legs, chair legs, lampstands, you name it, door handles. So please don't do that. You might even get arrested. So the heath family that this family is from includes some fruits that I know you're familiar with, blueberries and cranberries. Now, if I were to tell you that there is a medicinal use for cranberries, how many of you would say you've heard of that? Raise your hands. Okay, what have you heard? For the urinary tract. That's right, inflammation of the urinary tract. That's because this is another aquaretic plant. Like I mentioned, that the goldenrod was an aquaretic, a diuretic that does not lose electrolytes. But this one is different. This one is actually antiseptic to the urinary tract because the compounds in it, once they reach the kidneys, are converted into a bona fide antibacterial compound called hydroquinone. And that is the basis of how cranberry juice works. But the leaves of manzanita are much more potent than drinking cranberry juice. You can also use the fruits and make a cider, and it's delicious. So if you have medicine that's also delicious, that's a plus, I think. I like my herbal teas to taste good too. So you can make a drink that tastes kind of like agua de tamarindo, speaking of Mexican food, from the berries of the manzanita. They're beautiful. As I said, many different species that They're evergreen. They will become trees if they live long enough. And that's how they work, by literally killing bacteria in the urinary tract. Okay, questions about manzanita?
They drought tolerant as well.
They are drought tolerant as well, yes. They're one that does not like water in the summer. Okay, the next family, yeah. Yeah. No. Never heard of thorns on a manzanita. It's something else. Yeah. There's a bush that you see in landscaping called it starts with an N. I'm trying to think of it right now. I can't think of it, but it has kind of bigger, has fruits, red fruits about that big, and white flowers and lots of thorns. Yeah, that's not a native. The name is escaping me right now. It's something apple.
Natal plum.
Natal plum. Thank you. Natal plum. That's what you're seeing. Those fruits are edible, by the way. They're white. The fruit is white inside. It's sweet. It's a little mealy, but it's not bad. I eat them. Of course, I eat a lot of weird things. You can ask my wife about that. Okay, the beech family includes beech nuts. I've never seen a beech nut. Okay, I'm from California. How many of you have ever seen a beech nut or eaten a beech nut? I guess you're all from California. Well, you have. Okay. Same family as chestnuts. I've had a chestnut. And actually, if you look at the outside of a chestnut, it's a different shape, but it does resemble the outside of an acorn because they're in the same family. Chestnuts, beech nuts, and oaks are in the beech family. And there is a coast live oak right there. That is the most common oak in Southern California. It grows on the coast side of the mountains, just like the coastal sagebrush. Coastal side of the mountains. When you get on the other side of the mountains, like up in Pine Mountain and up that way, you'll get into the canyon live oak or the interior live oak. They're all called live oak because these do not lose their leaves in the winter. They're evergreen. This is Quercus agrifolia, coast live oak. This is Quercus lobata, because it has lobed leaves. So if you're from the east, you're going to look at this leaf and go, that's an oak. That is not an oak. That's an oak. Okay, but I have to differ with you. That is a California oak. They do have, and there's reasons why the plant evolved with that type of leaf. It has to do with trying to shed water away from the base, because these trees do not like water anywhere around the trunk. They will get a oak root rot fungus called armillaria, and they will die. It'll take a long time for them to die, and eventually they might drop things on you. So, if you see a big cluster of big mushrooms coming up around the base of your coast live oak, get an arborist over there right away. Anyway, oaks make acorns, and that's, the primary interest is for their edible use, to eat the acorns. We just did a workshop a couple of weeks ago, last weekend. Yeah, last weekend we had an acorn workshop. We processed the acorns and ground them to flour and leached them and made acorn pancakes. So acorns are edible, and they're a complete protein. They're really a great food, but they have to be processed. But medicinally, that astringency that you have in the acorns that you have to leach out, that's the tannins. And the tannins in the oak bark, the inner bark of the oaks, are used as an astringent, externally or internally, wherever you need to shrink tissues, heal wounds, get rid of excess fluid, you use an astringent. And that's where oaks come in. So used for sore throats, anti-inflammatory, also antibacterial, especially for sore throat, gargle, for washing, for making compresses, for rashes and wounds. So lots of use of oak bark, the leaves as well, and also the oak galls, which are these funny round balls that you'll see in oak trees that are actually from an insect. They're a gall from an oak gall wasp. But the oak tree makes it in response to the gall wasp laying its eggs in the wood. So the oak made it, but it's really the product of an insect and an oak. Okay, that's the beech family. Next up. Oh, questions about oaks or the beech family? Okay. You know, they're considered drought tolerant, but even the mature oaks have been suffering now with this drought. We are in a long-term drought. Okay. I know people will want to be optimistic about it, but I'm telling you, we're in a long-term drought. We're probably in like a 20-year drought right now, but get ready because California has a documented 100-year drought in the 1500s. That doesn't mean it's dry for 100 years. It means that over that course of that time, we have been significantly below the annual amount of rainfall. We tend to make it up. Every 10, 20 years, we'll have a 1969 flood event where we get, 60, 70 inches of rain. But typically, if we get 12 inches of rain, that's not a bad winter around here with this kind of climate. When we get 4 or 5 inches, not so good. When we get a few years of 4 or 5 inches, not good. So these will struggle. They like to get their roots down into the water table, and once they do that, they're fine. That's why you find them growing near creeks, because they'll get down into the water table, and once the water table stays high enough, when the water table recedes, that's when they start suffering. Okay, the next family, speaking of the Mediterranean climate, the mint family. The mint family includes, and again, I'm going to read a list of popular Mediterranean culinary herbs of the mint family. Basil, sage, rosemary, thyme, oregano, lavender, and of course, peppermint and spearmint, the mint family. These are all aromatic plants, right? Because they have terpenes that are aromatic, give flavor to foods, but also medicinal. So we're going to start with one that is among the edible plants, although this one here is not really the edible one. I'm talking about sage. First, we're going to start with Salvia apiana because we're going in alphabetical order. Then we'll get to Salvia leucophila after that. Salvia apiana, white sage, famous herb. I know many of you have heard of white sage. Some of you have probably burned a white sage leaf, or you bought a bundle at the farmer's market. How many of you have bought white sage at a store, farmer's market? Okay. Please, the next time you want to do that, ask whoever's selling it where they got it. Ask them to show you their Forest Service collecting permit to show that they were legally collecting it. Ask them to show you proof that they have an organic farm and they're growing it. If not, they're poaching it. That's illegal. And this plant has now made it onto the list I mentioned earlier, the United Plant Savers Species at Risk list. It's not endangered yet because there's plenty of it where you can't get a car near it. But anywhere that it grows, if you can drive a car near it, it has been over-harvested. And there are crews out there harvesting tons of this stuff and, carrying it off in burlap sacks. And then eventually it filters down to your local crystal shop, and it looks like the coolest spiritual thing. It's not spiritual when it's been ripped out of nature like that. Back off the soapbox. So yes, white sage is one of the plants that's used for smudging, and I've already talked about that. It's a native as all these are. It's perennial, so hold that thought. It's a perennial, so once you get a plant going, it will keep growing. Not forever. They do have a lifespan, but I've seen some white sage with trunks like that big around. So they will keep on growing and form a big woody trunk. They can get up to 3 to 4 feet in height, and then some or most of the stalks will put up a flowering stalk. Not all of them, but most of them put up a flowering stalk, and that can be up to like 8 feet high, with white flowers with a little kind of a lavender tinge to the flowers. Its common name, white sage, comes from those white flowers, not from the fact that the leaves look like they're kind of white. It's from the flowers. And purple sage, Salvia leucophila that we're getting to, has purple flowers. The leaves are the medicinal part. They are antiseptic, naturally antiseptic. It works as a decongestant, either drunk as a tea or you make a tea and you inhale the tea as a steam inhalation. It's one of the methods described in my book. It's a really effective way to use herbs. Inhale the steam. I won't go into the details right now because we have 15 minutes left. It's also an antiperspirant taken internally. It reduces secretions. Women use it to stop breastfeeding. People use it for excess night sweating. But a 1991 study, I'm going to read this, confirmed that white sage was able to completely inhibit the growth of Staphylococcus bacteria on the skin, Candida fungal infections internally, and Klebsiella bacteria associated with pneumonia. That plant right there. It could be drunk as an infusion, a steep tea, taken in a tincture mixed with water, or used as a steam inhalation. The major constituents are those terpenes that I've been talking about, the monoterpenes, including eucalyptol, camphor, pinene, carine, camphene, and the list goes on. These monoterpenes, as a group, have shown anti-anxiety, antimicrobial, and pain-relieving activity in numerous studies which are cited in my book. Okay, white sage, question. Mosquito repellent? I don't think just having it in your garden is going to keep mosquitoes away. No. You're better off burning the smudge. And, white sage is not the only thing you can burn. Coastal sagebrush and mugwort are much more common. They're not in danger at all. You can burn these, the dried leaves of these as a smudge. And there are other plants too. You can take the flowering heads. Where's the Salvia leucophila? The next plant, I'm going to just segue into the purple sage. Purple sage makes big, compact clusters of flowers, and then seeds, and then the flower heads dry. You can take those dried flower heads, put them in an ashtray or a shell or something, and light them. And they will smolder and make the same kind of smoke as white sage. And then you're not, you're just taking a dry part of the plant that it's going to get rid of anyway. And you're not having to harm the plant at all. So this is purple sage. This is a cultivar. It's called Bee's Bliss. It says it gets 1 foot high and 3 feet wide. It's described as a tough but handsome California sage that grows low and dense, good for a ground cover. So, just amazing. These, the horticulturalists have found these cultivars, many of them growing on the islands, as I mentioned, and have developed them into nursery stock for different situations. So this is the, do you have the full-size Salvia leucophila, Richard, as well as the compact? Richard? Do you also have the full-size plant or just the compact cultivar?
For the Apiana or the
leucophila, Salvia leucophila.
Right now we don't.
Right now they just have the compact one, okay? This, by the way, have you ever grown sage? Maybe you bought some sage here in the herb section. Look at these leaves. Don't like that leaf. Rub one of those leaves. Smell like sage? This is the one you can use as a substitute for sage. You grow this in your yard, you never have to buy sage again. So you can just stuff turkeys until next Thanksgiving. Purple sage, as I said, has purple flowers. Both of these sages, in fact, all of these plants of the mint family, the bees love them, the butterflies love to come to the purple sage. They're great, pollinator plants. The purple sage is mainly used as a spice, as a seasoning, but also you can make a foot soak with a tea of purple sage or black sage, which is even stronger than purple sage, and soak your feet in it for pain. Works on the same principle that I described with the sagebrush, that the terpenes go right through and interact with the pain receptors in the nervous system, straight through the skin by soaking your feet. And again, that's all described in the book. Okay, question? Yes. So when I say that purple sage has a purple flower, you could take 10 different purple sage plants and compare the flowers, and there's going to be subtle differences. Some are going to be a little pinker purple. Some are going to be a little more lavender purple. And again, lavender is in the mint family. Also very aromatic, right? It's not in my book because it's not in California. It doesn't grow wild in California. My book is just plants that grow wild in California. Not all natives, some non-natives like fennel grows wild, but lavender does not grow wild. So, you're next. So you can find lure flowers, and some of the different cultivars may have been bred for certain shades of color. Yes? Can the purple sage be grown in a container, and how tall does it get? It'll get about 3 to 4 feet tall. I think you could grow purple sage in a container, but it's got to have lots of drainage. I know white sage will grow in a container, but again, they need lots of drainage. That's the key to growing sage. Some people put them up on a mound in their garden just to make sure that they're never sitting too low when we get a lot of rain and the water puddles up. You always want them up above that. Yes? Not in detail, no. Again, that was something that I told the editor, I'm going to be including information on how to grow these plants. And they said, oh no, this is a field guide, it's not a gardening book. I said, I know, but in order to send people out into nature to start picking these plants, it's only responsible of me to tell people to grow them instead of going out and picking them in nature. So I have small sections on cultivation. And that's why I send you to the calscape.org website, or my website, my herbwalks.com website has a page called Resources. All free information, hundreds of websites with sections. There's a section on growing natives. There's another section below that on native plant nurseries with links directly to the nurseries. So I definitely encourage you, as your space and your climate permits, to grow these plants. Yes, that's why we're here at Green Thumb, right?
Real quick comment for anybody that uses the sage for cooking. Do not use white sage in.
Okay, thank you, yes. She said, for cooking, do not use white sage for cooking. Okay. That is the medicinal one right there. That's not the edible one. I like the flavor of a leaf in my water bottle, but not to cook with it.
Don't use it
And only experienced chefs know how to use black sage. Black sage can be used, but it is so strong, it will immediately overpower anything. But purple sage is the one. If you want something that mimics the taste of commercial garden sage, it's the Salvia leucophila. Okay, any more questions before we move on to the next family? We have 5 minutes. We're getting there, but not fast enough. That's right. So, I'll keep going, but I do have somewhere else I have to be later. But anyway, the next family is the poppy family, right there. So in my book, I describe California poppy, which is a sedative. I mean, we all know about opium poppies, right? Opium poppies have opioids. They have opium. They are actually addictive. But within the poppy family, there are plants like California poppy, which is not sold here. You can probably get seed. Can you get seed here for California poppies?
You can get seeds. Yeah.
Okay. It's typically planted from seed, but this is the famous Matilaha poppy. It's possibly the most famous native plant from California. You can find them growing in England, around the world, because this has the largest flower of any California native plant. Raise your hand if you've seen a Matilaha poppy flower. So, again, almost everybody. Huge white flowers with big yellow centers. We call it the fried egg flower. These like full sun. They got to have full sun. They are totally drought tolerant after their first summer. So once they're established, totally drought tolerant. They're also a plant that spreads by sending out rhizomes. So they will take over your yard after the first couple of years. But that's where that root barrier comes in. I hope you sell out a root barrier today, Richard. That'll show that people are taking this to heart. It typically likes sandy to gravelly soil, but it'll grow in soil with some clay in it. I see it growing in Miners Oaks, which is basically a kind of a clay loam soil. So it's pretty forgiving, but it has to be well drained. It will not sit in water. So if it's clay soil, it's got to have good drainage. You don't need to fertilize it. This is one that's not good for containers. This has to go in the ground. Like, take that home, put it right in the ground. Now, this is when it starts to go dormant this time of year. And this is the time of year when you take your established plants and you go out around them and you dig up some of those roots, and you just take a piece of root and stick it in the pot or in the ground somewhere else, and you can propagate them that way really easily. But this is a great way to get started with it, to get a plant here. And then you cut them back every year. Cut them back to like within 6 inches off the ground. People make the mistake of just leaving them, and then they just get taller and leggier, and they really don't look that good. But you cut them back, they'll make beautiful new growth every year, year after year. They're just great that way. And like the California poppy, they also have alkaloids, but they're not opium. They're a different kind of alkaloid, but also have sedative properties. So the California poppy, as described in my book, is used for insomnia, as a sedative. There is no research on using this medicinally, but there's a good chance that the flowers of this plant could also be used as a tea, like California poppy. Extremely bitter, though. Alkaloids are bitter, so when you know a plant has alkaloids, you can expect something bitter. Okay, questions about Matilaha poppy? Yes? What? When it goes dormant, so like November, December, once it's all done flowering and the flower seeds have dried, anytime after that, you can cut it back. Yeah, and cut it way back. Okay, any other questions about Matilaha poppy? All right, the next family, I did mention the third most important food for the historical Chumash was buckwheat seed. Again, show of hands. How many of you have ever had buckwheat pancakes? Okay, you know, some of you need to try some buckwheat pancakes. Be a little more adventurous. This is the very common California, isn't it California buckwheat? Looks like it, yeah. Eriogonum fasciculatum. Or just call it California buckwheat and spare your mouth having to say fasciculatum. This is in the buckwheat family. It's not the same genus as the Japanese buckwheat from which the buckwheat flour in your pancakes is made. But we just had a workshop 2 weeks ago where we processed wild dried buckwheat flours, and we sorted the seeds out from the dried flours, and then we ground the seeds into flour, and we had buckwheat flour, and we made buckwheat cake. We made a buckwheat apple cake with that flour. And I've used it at home to make buckwheat pancakes. So that's a great food, and here's the great thing about it. As you may know if you've studied nutrition, grains are from the grass family, and they're the seeds of grasses, right? Oats, rye, wheat, corn, barley, millet, maybe there's a couple more. They are not complete proteins. They're missing a couple of important essential amino acids. You cannot live on a diet of just those grains. You have to supplement that diet with something from the pea family, from a legume. So that's why traditional diets, you've got rice and beans, you've got rice and tofu. You've always got that combination going in traditional cuisine to make complete protein. Well, buckwheat is not, even though it has wheat in the name, it's not a grain. It's not from the grass family. It's the buckwheat family. It's a complete protein. You can live on buckwheat flour, or you can add buckwheat flour to your wheat flour and turn your wheat products into a complete protein. That's a pretty cool thing, if you don't mind the taste of buckwheat, which I happen to love. So I'm in complete protein heaven with that. This is an evergreen. Even in nature, it can vary a lot in its appearance, and there are probably some cultivars. But this is the most common, the California buckwheat, and it's one of the most common plants in all of California, especially coastal California. It will get up to 5 feet high and about 8 feet across once it's reached full maturity. But you can cut it back, you can prune it, and get it to fit in your garden. It has the most beautiful flowers. They start out with these like pom-poms, little round flower heads, not that little. And they start out pinkish white, and then as they get mature in the summer, the white turns into kind of a mottled rust red and white. And then eventually when they're dry, the whole flower head is a rust red color. And they just really add a lot of color to the landscape, and it's a great way to add some color to your landscape in the fall when they turn colors. They're easy to grow, they're drought tolerant. Again, they like drainage. Typically the native plants that like to grow in dry places are getting good drainage because they're growing on slopes in the mountains here. Yeah.
Can they be cut back if you don't want them to get too big?
Yeah, they can be pruned back, absolutely. And there are many species of buckwheat besides this one. There are varieties from the islands. There's Santa Cruz Island buckwheat and others that from the islands that are. Do you have any of those other? Nothing right now, but typically they will have some of those too. Much bigger plants, bigger flowers, etc. But the main thing there is the seeds. There's also. Do you have the Seacliff buckwheat here today? Not right now. There's also a cultivar of buckwheat that's a small, low-growing version that is found naturally on sea cliffs and sand dunes. So it's called either sea cliff buckwheat or dune buckwheat. Any buckwheats that make seeds, you can use the seeds. Okay, and our last family, we're almost going to make it. We didn't make it. It's 12:04. Thank you for staying late. I will finish with the rose family. How many of you have eaten anything from the rose family lately? Raise your hand. Okay, let me read you the fruits from the rose family, then I'll ask for a show of hands. Apples, pears, peaches, cherries, apricots, almonds, blackberries, and strawberries. How many of you have eaten anything from the rose family? Oh, okay. And they're all named for the type genus of the family. The family is named the Rosaceae family, the rose family, for the rose. And another one of these plants that's considered a native, this is a native because we know it's a native because its name is Rosa californica. And it has that in the name, that means it's a native. So don't grab and rub the leaves of this plant because it's a rose, it has thorns. Why does it have thorns? Because otherwise animals would have eaten it into extinction a long time ago. Yeah, it's a little astringent, but I've seen deer grazing on oak leaves, and these are much more astringent than a rose leaf, so that's why the thorns are there. The plants either use stinging hairs like nettles, or they have thorns or spines or something to keep them from being eaten. If that doesn't work, they have chemicals, and that's what we've been talking about all this morning, is all these different chemicals that plants use to either keep from getting eaten or to protect them from disease. So that's the wild rose. We went out of order a little bit because I started talking about it. So in alphabetical order, we'll get back to Toyon, which is Heteromeles. This is Rosa. So Rosa californica. The wild rose, think of it more like a rambling rose. It's not naturally not a compact rose like the commercial cultivars that you'll find here, and there are hundreds, or at least 100 of those, right? This is more of a rambling rose, but it can be pruned. I've seen it pruned into a nice compact little shrub, like a bush. It's really nice. It makes beautiful pink flowers, and the rose hips are edible. They're also nutritious. They're full of vitamin C. The leaves are used as a mild astringent wash. I've mentioned astringents a number of times. Anytime you need a external wash or even internal use of an astringent to tighten up tissues, you can make a tea of rose petals, rose leaves, and the fruits called hips, the rose hips, are edible and full of vitamin C. The other two plants from the rose family are Toyon, which is a Spanish pronunciation of a Northern California Indian name for the plant. A lot of, and here's that's Prunus. No, this is salicifolia. Toyon. Oh, there's Toyon. Okay, so this is Toyon. The early settlers, when they saw it making berries in December, which is what it does, it's one of the only natives that has berries going on in December and January. When they saw these winter berries on this, they called it Christmas berry. They also called it California holly because it has spiny, glossy leaves and red berries. If you've ever seen a true holly plant back east, that's what they look like. So they called it California holly. And then they found a lot of it growing in the hills outside of Los Angeles. And they named that area Holly Canyon. You see where this story is going? Eventually, the little town of Hollywood was created there, and that's the story of where the name came from. I know you'll find other stories online, urban legends, but that's the story I stand behind. So the medicinal part of this is those red berries. They have to be picked when they're fully ripe, which might not be until January or even February. It depends. Every year is a little different. It's nature. Nature doesn't follow our schedules. You pick the berries when they're dark red, fire engine red, really ripe, and then you dry them. You can't eat them fresh. Well, you can. You can eat anything once. But these won't kill you, but you won't want to eat another one if you try to eat them fresh. They're so astringent. There's that astringency again. But you dry them, and they taste like little dried cherries, like dried apricots, because I mentioned the fruits from that family. And the Chumash would feed these to the elders who were starting to lose their memory. They didn't know about Mr. Alzheimer at the time, but they were treating Alzheimer's disease. So a pharmacologist who I cited many times in my book, named James Adams, who recently retired from USC School of Pharmacy, took these berries into the lab and he studied them, and he found they have several compounds that can protect the brain from deterioration. Various different mechanisms. I won't get into all the details, but basically the stuff is in there, in those berries. The Chumash would eat whatever fit in the cup of the palm of the hand of the person. That was their daily dose. They would chew those up, and, chew them and chew them and chew them, and eat that much every day to, what was I talking about? To maintain their memories. Okay, so that's toyon. It's a really beautiful shrub. It will grow into a tree. See, you've already got, it tends to want to put out lots of shoots at the base, but if you were to just grow one trunk, you would end up with a tree. This is going to turn into a shrub. You can have it either way. We have 2 shrubs in our yard, and right now they're just loaded with berries. The berries are still green because they get a lot of shade from an oak tree, so they will grow in the shade. They prefer some sun. They do really well in partial shade. They're like a forest plant. They'll grow in and around the other trees. And birds love them. The robins and mockingbirds, which are songbirds, will come to your yard to eat the toyon berries. Cedar waxwings like them for the red pigment because they use that to make their little red spot. They're easy to grow. They can grow very quickly, and they will take some summer water. You can also prune them into a hedge if you want. But speaking of hedges, let's go to the last plant, holly-leaf cherry. Holly-leaf cherry is really an excellent hedge plant. That would be the number 1 hedge plant that I would recommend. That's it, yeah. So here's one, and Richard has that's Catalina cherry, right? So I've got the holly-leaf cherry. This is the mainland native cherry. Richard has the Catalina cherry. See how the leaves are bigger? But same kind of leaf with the spines around the edge of the leaf, the same glossy texture and the color, and they both make cherries. Yes, they make edible cherries. The cherries on the Catalina cherry are bigger, so people like those because they're bigger. But either way, you're going to get 90% pit and 10% fruit out of these cherries. They were bred for a long time to make a cherry that's 90% fruit and 10% pit. But the fruit's still delicious. And the pits actually were what Mr. Chumash ate. They, because it's related to almonds, they cracked the pits open, got the meat out of the pits. It's like a nut in there. And they made a kind of an almond meal out of it by leaching the cyanide out. Yes, it has cyanide. These can be pruned. I used to take care of an estate years ago that had a hedge that was like 12 feet high, about 3 feet wide, and it went on for like 50, 60 feet. Lined a driveway of holly leaf cherry. Makes flowers, fruit. It's a wonderful, wonderful plant. and it's not susceptible to the root fungus that infects the oak trees. So it's another plus for it. But the medicinally herbalists use the inner bark. So you get a mature limb, and then in my book I explain how to do that, how to harvest the bark. It's the inner bark. So what you're seeing here is the outer bark. Inside, on the inside of that, against the wood, is the inner bark. That part is scraped off, and that is a sedative for coughs. It's a cough suppressant. You have two kinds of cough medicine. An expectorant helps you get the mucus out. It helps you cough if the mucus is stuck in there. But if you're coughing too much and you need to stop the coughing, at least temporarily, you use a sedative that's a cough suppressant. And that's what the wild cherry bark does. That's why so many old-fashioned cough drops and cough syrups are cherry flavored. It goes back to using the cherry bark and then flavoring the syrup with the cherries, because they're the same plant. But it's not the fruit, it's that bark that's the medicinal part. We've run a little over, but that concludes my presentation.